Before we start today's video, I want to bring to you a quick word from our sponsor, Surfshark. Surfshark is all you need in a VPN and more. They keep all your data safe and protect all your devices. One of the many features from Surfshark that I love using is you can travel the world in just one click. Let's say you live in America and you don't have access to some shows you want to watch on Netflix. You can then easily connect to a different country's server and binge away. This works for other countries and some streaming services too. Another great thing is that Surfshark allows you to find the best deals when you shop online. Surfshark also automatically blocks more than 1 million known malicious websites and other threats. With over 3,200 servers in 65 countries, you'll definitely find what you're looking for with Surfshark. Right now, you can get Surfshark VPN at https://surfshark.deals/criminalcore and use code CRIMINALCORE for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. Again, use code CRIMINALCORE for 83% off and a whole 3 months for free. The link is the first thing you'll see in the description. 48-year-old Susan Winters lived in Henderson, Nevada in 2015 with her husband Gregory Brent Dennis and 2 teenage daughters. Susan was a judge and Gregory was a doctor. On January 3, 2015, Gregory called 911 to report Susan was unresponsive and needed an ambulance. She was taken to the hospital but did not make it. A mixture of antifreeze was found in her system. At first, it was believed that she might have taken her own life by ingesting the antifreeze. Investigators then found Gregory had an expensive drug habit. He also stood to inherit $2 million in the event of his wife's demise. According to friends, Gregory and Susan was on the verge of separation when her life ended. Investigators also found that Gregory only called emergency responders after she stopped breathing. Inexplicably, Gregory also signed a do not resuscitate order when she arrived at the hospital. Days after Susan's passing, Gregory deposited a $180,000 check from her bank account into his own bank account. The check had been issued the night before Susan lost her life. According to a friend of Gregory, he wanted the money because he knew Susan's parents would freeze the account. This meant that Gregory knew Susan would not be alive anymore before it happened. The final piece of evidence came when investigators took a look at Gregory's computer. He searched for information on the internet on how long after poisoning someone using antifreeze it would take the victim to pass away. In 2017, he was finally arrested in connection to the case. Shortly after being arrested, he posted a $250,000 bail and was released. In 2022, Gregory and his legal team pleaded guilty and agreed to a sentence of 3 to 10 years behind bars. He is scheduled to be sentenced on May 10th in the Clark County District Court. On November 17, 1978, a person cutting firewood in Klamath County, Oregon, came across 2 bodies, a young man and woman. Both of them had been fatally shot. Carl Burkhart, who was then a detective for the Klamath County Sheriff's Office, arrived at the scene soon after. Investigators quickly identified the first body as 19-year-old Kirk Leonard Wiseman. The second was identified as 17-year-old Cynthia Lynn Frayer. In the autopsy, it was discovered that Cynthia had been indecently assaulted. Neither of the 2 victims had a connection to the Klamath County area. Then, Chief of Police Dan Tomel was quoted as saying that day, "You could tell whoever did it didn't have much respect for human life, the way the bodies were disposed." Deputies determined that Kirk and Cynthia had been hitchhiking through the area. One of the few items recovered from the scene was a sign that read, "K Falls." Police also determined that the 2 had stayed a night at the motel in Rosenberg, Oregon, and was then picked up by a person who claimed to have dropped them off at the Grants Pass restaurant. They also found a letter written by Cynthia, addressed to her mother, which mentioned that she and Kirk had lots of fun in Washington State. That was all the investigators had. They knew who the victims were, but not who had taken their lives. The original evidence bags from 1978 remained locked away in storage throughout the years. By 2011, Detective Nick Kennedy took over the case. He looked through the pieces of evidence for anything that could potentially be analyzed for DNA. DNA was a tool that didn't exist for law enforcement back in 1978, but the technology was becoming better every decade. Later, Detective Geneva Lewis took over for Nick Kennedy. She sent a few items of Cynthia's clothing to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. From 2011 to 2018, little DNA was found on the items, because by then, they were already more than 30 years old. It was only in 2019, when Detective Dan Towery took over the case, that a breakthrough would come. He received a call from Devin Mast, who worked for the crime lab. Devin Mass told him that they finally found DNA belonging to an unknown man that they could use. Devin sent the samples to another lab in Portland, Oregon. They confirmed the presence of a DNA from an unknown male. It wasn't much of a breakthrough, but it was the first one police had in decades. The DNA sample was then entered into the Combined DNA Index System, a nationwide database of DNA samples. Unfortunately, there were no hits. Detective Dan Towery then decided to contact Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon had been vital in solving many cold cases over the last few years. For Parabon to test the DNA sample and help identify the person that took Kirk and Cynthia's life would cost $8,000. Investigators decided it was well worth it if it could bring peace to the families of the victims. Parabon then used genetic genealogy to predict the suspect's ancestry. They used that to produce what they call a snapshot image to show what the man looked like. Parabon also used the DNA to find relatives of the suspect. In 2021, they told investigators that they had a viable suspect, Ray Whitson Jr. Parabon also said that his DNA was found on Cynthia's clothing, indicating that he was definitely involved. Investigators then tried to locate Whitson. They soon learned that he passed away in Texas in 1996. He had no criminal history. At the time of the crime, he lived in Klamath County area, where he worked at a lumber mill. Investigators collected DNA samples from 2 of Whitson's living children. This confirmed that it was his DNA found on Cynthia's body and other pieces of evidence. Whitson's children also confirmed that he owned the same type of weapon that was used at the crime. The area where Cynthia and Kirk was found was also known to be frequented by Whitson. When investigators were confident with their findings, a report was submitted to the Klamath County District Attorney, Eve Costello, for review. Costello said she determined that the evidence would be strong enough to prosecute Whitson if he was alive today. If we had just been 10 or 15 years earlier, we would have been able to hold the individual accountable in a way that we now cannot do, said Costello, tears welling in her eyes. What we have been able to do is bring closure for a family, because when somebody's life is taken and you don't know really what happened, you just know they left the universe in a really awful way. It leaves you with a really huge, hollow feeling. This work has allowed that family to have some degree of peace. The letter that Cynthia wrote to her mother could now finally be given to her, as it was a piece of evidence for all these years. In July of 2009, an unknown man broke into an apartment of a woman in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He restrained her, then indecently assaulted her before running away. The woman called 911. DNA from the unknown man was then collected. In 2021, investigators used advances in DNA to finally identify the man. In 2022, 39-year-old Phillip Alford was arrested in connection with the case. His DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene.